Thank you very much. My name is Clifford Carnicom. I'm here to serve you today, and I wanted to give some thanks that are due to start with. I wanted to thank John White and all the organizers of this conference. I wish to thank my wife, Carol, who is important in ways that many of us would never know for over 15 years in terms of what has happened. I wish to thank all the researchers and presenters and speakers that have been here today. I want to give a special thanks to Dr. McClure, who is amongst our organization and is here today. I wish to give thanks to the staff of this organization, and it is also why and how I'm here today with their help. And I wish to give thanks to you. And I mean all of those people sincerely, as we all have taken a part in what's happening here. I'll be nervous maybe for a couple of minutes. It'll pass. Got a little bit of management going on today that I think will pass too, I hope. I'll have a huge challenge ahead of me in terms of time. I'm notorious in my head for thinking I'll cover something in 5 or 10 minutes and it would take a half hour. It's a constant thing, and I will have that challenge. And what I'll have to do is just try and keep my priorities straight the best I can. I planned the talk for an hour and a half, roughly. I know that I can't not go over it. I'll give you 2 little clues to look for to sort of keep me in line. And I will be off, so it's a matter of how many of you give me clues. But on the top right of these slides, occasionally you'll see a slide number. We've got to get through about 65 of them today. We may end up skipping half of them, I don't know. And in the bottom right, I'll have a rough idea of the time that I've got to be on. So that's my little police cop along the way that I'll need some help with probably. And if we do skip slides, maybe several, we'll have to go with it because, again, it won't take too long. This is us as we exist now. The nonprofit was started about 4 years ago out of desire to extend myself, is what it amounts to those that can carry on and expand that which needs to be done. As you'll see, I have reached certain limitations as to what I'm going to be able to do without assistance and help. And there are some people that have come forth to make this happen, and that's us. I have some personal objectives in our presentation today, and these are those objectives. I would like us to leave today with a greater awareness, and I'm a pretty heavy person in some ways, is that I don't shirk from what I think is responsibility. And I will be asking for you to be responsible for where we go when we leave here. I have a goal of giving you some of what you would call the hardline information that we need to know and help us know what is real and what is not real. And I suppose that's a little bit of the science world and that kind of stuff that I do a little bit of. And we'll be spending a little bit of time going over some of that. When we finish that, I'd like to give an idea where we need to go, at least from what I can see. And then the last is, which is truly the real value, to start thinking, and already start thinking about it now, because we'll need it. But start thinking about how you are going to unify your energy. Those are personal goals that I have. These are what we could call procedural goals. These are things I would like to get done. I'll never make it through all of them. I could pick that number 3 and I could probably be here for 3 days. So we're going to be skipping a lot of things, but this is what I would like to try and get through, and I'll have to set my priorities. I do think that it is likely that the priorities will be on what you see as number 4 and number 5, and a bit of number 6 there. I think those will probably be the spots that I'll need to hit the strongest and wish to hit the strongest. And rather than repeating them all, what you'll see there in general is a progression towards laying a little foundation, and then to at least give some summary and credit to the history of work that's brought us here. But rather than repeat a certain level of information that is out there in the public domain, I would like to present an argument to us here tonight. And that argument is not a comfortable argument at all, but it will be that our problem is much bigger than we may be aware of. And this problem is extending well beyond the consideration of what we would call geoengineering by itself. Okay, very brief foundation. In my own head, I was going to read this, and maybe I will, but let's just get through this beginning. And this is this business of, what is engineering to begin with? Terminology will be important. You'll see that, I try to be cautious. I'm not perfect, but I try to be cautious with my terminology. Let's at least understand what engineering is about. Engineering in general, it's the design and the creation or the alteration of a system. That the method usually involves technology. There's a very interesting phrase that came out in the definitions that I was looking for, that engineering usually involves craft, cunning, and skill. An interesting phrase which applies, and not necessarily in a negative way. And obviously then the inference there will be that once we have such a system to either alter, design, or plan, or create something, then we apply it to something, and this has caused the emergence of new terms to exist for us, such as geoengineering and bioengineering, because now we are at that point of saying, let us apply it to the earth. Let us apply it to life. And this is how these terms have evolved, and I think they are very suitable and reasonable terms. Most people understand that I do not use a certain term called chemtrails, and I've been over that argument many times before, so I won't belabor you with it now. This is a slide meant to visually summarize what is available to you should you choose to delve into it. This slide visually represents approximately 14 years of labor, investigation, and research. This slide represents approximately now 300 pages of research that I have completed, not entirely from me, but the bulk of them from my work, and roughly 1,000 pages of material. The honest truth is that the material is not entirely organized, but it's all out there. It is organized by date, and you can get to any one by keyword. And I could spend and have spent much of my time talking about these papers and what they lead to and digging into the nitty-gritty of these papers. We will not have time for it today, but we're going to do some of it, but I'm going to have to get to a summary view of this type of work so that we can progress to where we need to get to tonight. I will have a challenge for me tonight, and I have a case to make. It's the first time that I will have done this publicly. That case it's been in my mind for many years. It's pretty deeply embedded in me, but I am aware gradually that just because it's in my mind does not necessarily mean that it's in the public venue. And that's my challenge tonight, is try and make that transformation to these years of work in a particular crosslink, that crosslink being between geoengineering and bioengineering in a more understandable and apparent way than it may have been in the past. And so that's what's new for me tonight. This is a summary of the steps that I go through in my work. They are not interesting reading, but obviously very important in terms of the work, and the steps are what? Documentation, sampling, analysis, and synthesis. Basically the underpinnings of the scientific method. There are certain variations of that theme that can be stated, but in general, this is how the work has progressed over the years, and that is to see what's there, to observe what's there, to gather data about what is there. And then we get to the point where we analyze and try to understand what is there. And then eventually we get to the point where we synthesize this data and attempt to interpret in a more comprehensive goal. These are the general steps that my mind process generally goes through, being somewhat of a, there are analytical qualities to my mind, but I also have been known to play harmonica once in a while in my life too. There are other things on my mind. Underneath these four, you'll see that reference to political, governmental, and social undercurrent underlies these events. So yes, you have this going on, you have that work, but I'm very much aware. What really happens in the end is what we communicate to one another, right? You can have everything in a library that you want, but unless somebody knows what's in that library, it doesn't mean anything. So I realize that underneath this is a whole important world, and this is a world that's here. And that is communication and people, understanding, communication, and comprehension. That's what underlies the net effect of the processes above. All right, let's see where we're at. We'll keep track there. So I was probably supposed to be, yeah. All right. So this is a list. Again, these things will have to be brief, but a lot of you may have seen this list. But I showed you the previous page of the 300 papers. I would say done from a fairly impartial point of view. I mean, we can all have our agenda, but I was trained in the sciences, and I try to apply myself honestly and forthrightly. And I do the work. And this is a record of people and organizations, agencies, and whatever that expressed an interest in my work, I guess would be a nice way to say it. And you will see some rather notable names on this list. We'll just pick a couple examples just to get it started. Basically, it's summarized as being the leading and primary and really comprehensive set of military, corporate, health, media, intelligence, political organizations, or agencies that exist in this country or across the world. These entities did show an interest in my work fairly quickly. This is actually a snapshot. You cannot get this kind of information easily now. Things have changed. But this type of event was recorded within a year or two of doing my work. Now, the contradiction which arose, you have three parts going on. One, you have a person, no notoriety of any kind, does his work, starts saying, I have a responsibility here to make this information available to the public. That goes on. Secondly, you have a list of entities that express, to me, a higher level of interest than one might expect in that research and monitor it fairly closely. And then the third, you have these same entities, organizations, and agencies publicly assuming a platform of dismissing the entire body of research and issue as being of no consequence and of no importance. And in fact, much even further than that, go to the point of attempting to marginalize the presenter, the messenger, as well as dismiss the subject or subjects, as well as refuse to acknowledge any seriousness of the issues or investigate these issues. This was the portrait that emerged early in the game, which presented serious sort of contradictions in terms of logic of importance and value. This is the example of what I was just speaking of on the political response, and I'll have to skip through it, but basically you have that contradiction of saying it looks like we have an interest in your work, but we think nothing is important, and in fact we think this whole issue is a fraud or a hoax or issues and of no importance. This photograph is meant to signify an opening day. I'm going to give you the opening and the close because we have a 14-year period now that has transpired. And this is simply for the record being that on February 14th, 1999 was the very first day that I posted to the world a set of photographs, offered them to the world, and said, it appears to me that something unusual is taking place. And what caused these photos to arise was the fact that in Valentine's Day on 1999, I just stopped. Being that I went outside, we were on our way out to go camping or so, as we would often and still do, and I looked outside and I saw what would be photo number 1 on your left side there. And the difference was, at this time, I just stood there. The reason being that on a subconscious level, there was something that had been developing over the past couple months. And that's operating at a subconscious level. The decision is made, take the photograph. Today, let's just sit for a few minutes. So the process of observation takes place, the middle photograph occurs, and you start to see a transformation that is out of alignment with my experience, much of which has involved the natural world in my life. I've been in the civilized world, in offices that might be a little bit, where they can be important, but there's another part of my life that's very important, and this is the natural world. And that's ever since I was a little kid. And so that middle photograph catches my attention this time, that we have a record of a transformation that is a little bit unusual. Because even as a kid, I remember 12 years old watching aircraft. Like I say, I don't consider myself out of tune with the natural environment. And I also study things. I remember when I was 19, I would go to the used bookstore, have nothing to do with school at all, and I would buy a book on meteorology and study it. So I wasn't totally foreign to certain principles in the physical world. And then on the last photograph on the right, a transformation had been made in a span of about 20 minutes of time. And this world that I knew in my memory banks and growing up, I knew that this world was undergoing a change, and that change was profound. This was a moment of recognition for me. That change was profound. That color blue that's not an act of chance. This world is not an act of chance. That blue has meaning to all of us in a very deep, profound, and spiritual way, ultimately. And when that blue was taken away, as it is here, I know when I recognize, at least from my heart, I know when something's wrong. And I know what my obligation is, responsibility is, and hence this was Clifford Carnicom announcing to the world something is amiss. This is 14 years later, and again we get to skip the details here, but this was right before a conference we held in October of last year. The point is, some of this is sad, and some of this is going to be good, and that's going to be our decision. I just got to call it as it is. I'm sorry, 14 years later, I'm right where I was. Okay, I'm sorry. But 14 years later, I'm seeing the same darn thing. And yes, it upsets me. But I'll get over it because I'll try to turn that energy into getting us together in terms of where we're going. But you ask me if that disappoints me, you bet it disappoints me. 14 years later that I have to show you this photograph? So we will need to be stepping up to this plate as we go along. I wish I didn't have to show it. Do you think I had other things to do in my life also, besides assuming this role? I don't regret it, but But do you not think I have other aspirations in my life? So the point will be to take advantage of those that offer their services and benefit and use it. And that's really all I ever want. Take it and move it forward. So what's happening here is that this is now the session and the section which will illustrate the nitty-gritty of the work. We're not going to have time for it. I've told you that the papers are there. It's available for you. That's who it's for. It's for you. They're not going to be fun to read, some of them. They're not going to be easy to read, and we'll need help getting them organized and more accessible to people. But they're in there. They're not too hard. You can't tell me if you can't put in a keyword or a date that that's too rough for us. So this is going to document some examples. This is just some examples. I'm used to having access to the net, so it's a little bit different for me to try and extract what's important in the time that I have. So very briefly, we'll step through them. But these will fall into one of those 4 stages that I talked to you about, right? Documentation, sampling, and analysis. These will be representative images that attempt to visually capture that process for you as to some of the work was done, knowing that it is only a small sample, and that many of the projects were repeated many, many times for reliability. You know, I don't know if you pronounce his name properly, but it's like Leuwenbach, this guy that invented the microscope, you know, back in the 16 or 1700s. I read a little story about this guy one time, how, you know, when he's under the scope, he's looking at something, and some people that would be enough to announce to the world, but this guy would just go back and back and back, and hundreds of times he would keep looking at what he saw to make sure that it was right, because it was a whole new paradigm, right, of world understanding. So there are many, many times when there are many repetitions of the work, and I'm going back slowly. I will do something sometimes and come back 2 or 3 years later and say, wonder if that's still happening. And sometimes it would be 2 or 3 times the process before it would be, you know, sort of made available to the public. That process continues in its own way today. So this is an example of a photograph that presented a problem. And the problem briefly is that emanations, dispersions from an aircraft were occurring a full width of an aircraft wing, what you'd call a laminar flow, essentially a sheet flow, but it doesn't match the engines. The engines on that aircraft, this is, you know, photographs are now coming along to where they're even better. All my stuff has been done with fairly limited resources. But if you look at the photograph closely, you'll see the engines are on the fuselage, okay? There's a problem there, that the emissions don't even match the engines. Now, I'm not saying all photographs are like this, but I started to catch a set during a certain period where I have 3 or 4 of these. It presented a contradiction. So this is this process of documentation. And I'll have to start stepping through these quicker here, I think, but this is pH testing. Back in 1999 or whenever it is, there's pH testing done. This was one of the first projects that I actually ever got the citizens across the nation to participate in. This data is coming from across the nation, examining whether there's an alteration in rainfall acidity and alkalinity, which is very important. These things are not trivial that we talk about. You know, in my recent work on studying chemistry and biochemistry, one of the big revelations there is that every chemical reaction in the world, biological, takes place at a specific pH and even a specific temperature range. And it's a window. You got to be in a certain window to have things work. So you don't just go saying, oh, I just changed the pH of the, you know, general ecosystem and no consequence. Huge consequence. And a small number means a big change. So I'm not going to go through the interpretation of all of them, but these are all statistical studies, and it showed a difference back in 1999. Statistically, this would be way off the charts, and on your side, it would be difference between red and black. Certain samples were starting to come in to me, physical samples, and I always am looking for corroboration and patterns all the time. And usually if I receive a single sample or single event, I don't dismiss it. but I do not give it undue importance. I simply register the sample. If I'll look at it, but it's just a registration process. It's when things repeat that I start to take an interest very quickly in terms of pattern or system analysis. And these were certain types of fibrous samples that were being seen environmentally. They were airborne samples that people were seeing of this unusual filament material. So that's an opening to that. We will be digging into that a little bit deeper tonight. The sampling process continues. HEPA filters collect materials down to submicron. So, and also I'm restricted by what I can get access to. In fact, I think the fellow just asked it to me today. They assume that somehow I have this little magical craft that takes me up at 30,000 feet, and it doesn't cost me a nickel, and I get sampling. And I have to say, I'm sorry, I'm ground-based. I'm limited resources. I do what I can. And all of my work is what I can do. And you will judge, in the end, the meaning and merit of that work, but you will find a continuous record of environmental sampling done under what I think are reasonable conditions given the availability of resources. Mold collection, we'll have to step through these quickly. A whole process of sampling takes place. And why, right? What's the reason? The reason is the air looks different. The air is changing. Now, we get to have common sense here. There's something in the air. You can debate all you want, but if you can't see to point A to point B, and I know how much you can see in clear air, it's roughly about 120 miles. You can prove it both visually as well as through models. But in clear air, you can see roughly 120 miles. When you can't see, and you start seeing mountains in your area that are 10 miles from you, and you can barely see them, I'm sorry, there's something in the air. So you have to start asking, what is in the air? You have to start going after it the best you can. Imagine having limited resources, but having a mind. What do you do? And this is what I do. And some of these things are ingenious. These are some of the best jury-rigging things in the world going on here, okay? This is a process that commercial factories and refineries use. Rather sophisticated, rather interesting. To clean the air, to collect particulate matter, to clean their system. In my case, it's it's a fan and a glass jar, and what's called a Van de Graaff generator. In other words, the principle is what drives it, and you'll see that what drives me. If you understand the principle, you apply it. And this is a jury-rigged version of a rather interesting process of collecting material in a most interesting, unusual way. Very effective. Most everything I've done over the years, I was pretty much also made fun of because you can't always going to say it's going to look professional, but I go by principle. And principle, you will find, is usually very direct and simple, and none of us, this intimidation we have about science, I hope someday it goes away for us, and we try to make it go away, because if you really dig into science, it's magic, and it's wonder, and it's principle that is so much at the core of life that if you can get to it, it's a fascinating part of the experience of life. And I always am asking myself, do I understand the principle? Or if somebody's talking about something, do we know the principle? Because you would be surprised and amazed at what you can do if you understand the principle. And if you don't understand it, it'll make itself known. These were all, I would consider these all rather profound and groundbreaking studies, even though they may look simple. And we save that discussion for another time, whenever those, have the interest in time where we can dedicate it to it. Today we're gonna get on to another section. More sampling, more culture. You start to see words like culture development taking place. This means Clifford's trying to grow something, right? He finds something, and he's trying to grow it. And what does that mean? That means he found something that has a biological nature to it. This, I'll make a brief comment on, and that it's an interesting part. There are many papers, I would say several, that they're there, but they're very low-key in that I'm not going to make a big deal out of them. But this is one of those papers that is very interesting to me. And I'm not saying it's a final answer, but one of the most basic questions that came up in these affairs of altering our atmosphere is when? When do they do this? Why are they there at this time? And as Scott Stevens was speaking about, and I unfortunately didn't get all of it, but I got a lot of it, and it fascinated me because that type of information really helps us to round out some things that we don't know. But a very basic question of when did they do this? And some of these questions vexed me for years. I would just sit on them because it just wasn't clear. And it's quite apparent to me in terms of what Scott said earlier today that I know why it vexed me. And it's because it's not simple sometimes. And that was a big one, as to when and why. And this was about a project that tried to identify for the first time why they might be there at a particular time. And it was rather interesting. But the finding had to do with the finding was that what you'd call local relative minimums would be the phrase. You know, in the math world, you have graphs, right? And so the graph goes up and down. At the bottom of a graph, doesn't matter how high it is, but at the bottom of a graph would be a local relative minimum versus a maximum. And if you look at that graph, you'll see this preponderance of where those orange sort of tracings over the line are as to what's going on there. And what's going on there is periods of low relative humidity and also ionization. I was also working with ionization counts in the atmosphere, and coupled with direct observation of activity, direct activity. And the finding is that indeed there is a pattern, and at least in this particular test, which spanned about, it looks like about 30 days or roughly a month, that it looks like there is a definite interest in points, and those are fairly narrow points of time. Those are, because I've noticed many times these operations would be over and done with within a couple hours. That thing's 30 days long, but if you look at the timing in those, you're talking about sometimes just a few hours in and out. And the finding was that there is a rather strong match with humidity and ionization levels, which is actually another piece of the many, many puzzles that take place. This slide depicts the repeated detection and observation of unexplained ambient ELF energy. I got to be careful about getting too deep into this stuff, but ELF is extremely low frequency. It is electromagnetic radiation. The gist of it here is this type of radiation is running where our minds and our body works. That's this type of radiation. Very hard to detect, by the way. It took me a year, I'm sure, to build that little guy, contraption. But it's where your mind works. And the other part of the problem here was that this particular radiation that was detected, again, over and over and over. You'll see the lowest number there on the various charts. You're going to see that the lowest number as being 4 hertz. And there's a little problem with that. And the problem is I still, to this day, have no logical explained source for what you would call a 4 hertz signal. 8 hertz would make a whole lot of sense in terms of Schumann resonance. But anytime you start dropping down lower than something that has to do with the size of the Earth itself, which is what this actually signifies, that creates some real interesting questions for us. Ambient meaning continually surrounding. That's what that means. Repeated over several years on many occasions. That's the same thing in a different type of format. And my research, it goes where it needs to go, wherever that is. Whether it's uncomfortable or not, it's just not a factor. It's just wherever it goes. And it was interesting on how the work eventually came around to this fellow called HAARP. I didn't go there originally. For a couple of years prior to my work, there was the buzz of the internet. I'm always aware of the buzz of the internet because that's that underlying social cultural thing that I was talking about, right? It's always there. But people were talking about HAARP, and people were talking how their minds were all controlled. And on my side, I'm saying, interesting, possible. I don't have anything for it, but it's interesting. But I wouldn't let the question go because it was a fair question to ask. I mean, that's what stuck out for me. The question was fair to ask. People were not particularly presenting evidence in a way that I would give too much credit to, but the question was a fair question. And my work led me into the HAARP patent, not the other way around where I thought somehow HAARP is important, let me go gather some data to see if it supports it. It was a process that brought me there. And so my solution to that, it wasn't easy to begin with, but my solution was once I'm aware of the existence of such a thing, I actually had to study this patent. When I first picked it up, it was totally foreign to me. It was new, totally new ground to me. Cyclotronic resonance, concentration of electromagnetic radiation, building up of energy. I had to read the patent, and I did, and it was a slow process, but it was a fascinating process of sort of comprehension and enlightenment in that years of work were actually now being expressed directly with the language. If we had the time, we would go through it and I would read them to you, but definite key phrases, things like increasing electron density, cyclotronic resonance, pumping huge amounts of barium into the atmosphere, okay? Heave weapon. These things came out and now started to cast meaning onto research which was done in a completely independent and arbitrary and objective fashion to precede it. And it was a fascinating process, not normally fun reading for most people, but it sure started connecting some dots. Another problem. There's been a lot of problems over the years, but another problem was that social and cultural presentation and promotion of agendas, quote, attached to this alteration of our planet. I noticed a rather, to me, disproportionate platform given to this idea that somehow this is to reduce global warming. And it was interesting to me that this platform was being given so much airtime because it started to present contradictions to me. One contradiction, and also that this was benevolent, that this is somehow good for us. This is a good thing. And this presented contradictions to me, because if I have something good to offer you, I would like to tell you. I would like to tell you if I thought I was doing something good for you. Why would I want to hold back on that? I would want to proclaim it. And such a thing never was taking place. There was no proclamation. It was always innuendo. That somehow it must be good for you, but really best we just don't talk about it or don't ask how and why and who and all these things. And that presented a problem to me. The other was the direct observational evidence. And I let this one set for many years, because I knew it had been given a good platform, really strong, and a lot of people were joining that bandwagon. And over the years, I just always sat back and I'm saying, something doesn't fit there. And secondly, direct observation didn't fit. Direct observation being basically an awareness of temperature changes with respect to the operations. And these were two major problems, in that it was going the opposite direction. And I sat with it for years. And finally one day, I just said, I got to get it out. And I created a model. And I'm not saying the model's perfect and everybody can evaluate it. I get occasionally called upon and criticized on my work, and I'll say, well, is your work peer reviewed? And the direct answer, now Dr. McClure will have a good answer for this, but my answer is no, I'm not peer reviewed. You are my peers, is what Dr. McClure will tell me, and he's right, and I know that, and that's why I'm not seeking peer review. I know about that system. I choose to be here. So I developed a model, and the models are attempts to express reality as we know it. Models are an act of creation also. Incredible imagination and creation can take place in the modeling process. But a good model attempts to be realistic, and this model pointed out through rationales, which we can discuss more as we go along, that it didn't fit. And very briefly, it has to do with if you stick something in the atmosphere and that stuff heats up quicker than the air does, that's called specific heat. But if you stick something in the atmosphere that heats up quicker than air, then it's going to heat up the atmosphere with the same amount of energy. And that's what is happening with the chemistry of what I was looking at that is behind this model. And it's what bothered me from day one. The chemistry said that's not what would happen. What would happen is it would elevate the temperature. And this is a model, finally I just got it out, and I am happy that I did so, because I needed it to be known that this is what the data showed. I was reserved because I knew it was against an entire apparent agenda-driven platform to convince us and you that these alterations were somehow for your own good. So that was an important model. I won't get into this one, but the work progressed into some geophysical work, a little bit more heady work, a little bit even deeper conceptual about consideration of actual planetary changes and effects, things that have to do with the rotational rate of the Earth. You'd get into problems involving tectonics and submission of energy and this type of thing. Interesting period of the work, probably took a year or two of my life in that. And still, you know, there's not a single paper that I have up there that I would retract. If I would retract it, I'd take it down. After 300, there's not a single one that I would retract. The only thing that I have that I would change, but it's still a part of the record, was in 1999 I used the word chemtrail in the opening papers. I stopped by the end of 1999 because I saw other problems that I won't talk about that have to do with language. This is an example of some of the culturing that is taking place over the years, quite extensive in terms of what's going on there. Okay, so what I'm trying to do is get through to this point where we're taking this, 300 papers, whatever, 14 years of work, and without going through all the detail at the level that we could, come to some type of understanding as to what I arrived at in that final process of what I would call synthesis. This is a list of what I call applications. Applications meaning I could do something. If I wanted to, the human mind could do something based upon the data and the analysis and work that had been done over the previous 14 years. This was a very slow evolving list. But the list had certain criteria to get on the list, and one of them was that it had to be consistent with all of the data. If you picked one of those, it had to be consistent with all of the data and all trials and all work over the many years. So it was hard and difficult to get it on the list, but once it made it to the list, it was pretty solid in terms of at least its basis of work. There was another problem that was starting to occur over the years that expressed a divergence from my work versus, again, what I heard as the public platform. The public platform was that we have basically a single issue involved here, and that it does involve this benevolent act of global warming and reduction of it. That was the general public perception that I have. My work was not going that way at all. My work was expanding in this very gradual fashion to the list that you see here before you, and many of us have probably heard me speak of this list. So again, I won't have time to go through it in detail. I think maybe I'll try to give us a single example or something like that. But the list is a result of evolution of work, sustained work over a long period of time with many repeated trials and considerable thought given to the process. And there's nothing to say positively that any one of these applications, quote, are actually in effect. There's nothing to say that all of them are not in effect. And there's nothing to say that there is no crossover between any of them, because reality would appear to indicate that all of these are very reasonable candidates for inclusion in this list. And so right away it says the problem, this is not so simple. This is a big guy. And I'm a person that does try to look, again, like I said, in terms of patterns and systems, because I do like the big picture first. The nitty-gritty detail is really important at some point, but I've got to, it goes back to that same thing I was talking about on understanding the principle, right? If we don't have that overall picture of what's happening, we're just drifting around. And I needed this. I needed this for my own understanding. And again, I wouldn't retract a single thing off of this list. And I would expect the list could only grow. But the list is solid from what I can offer to you. And very briefly, it said that environmental modification and control was indeed a very reasonable scenario to consider in this list. That affecting and control of weather being a subset of that indeed, that's quite consistent with the data. And the simple application of that would be that if you change what's called the heat capacity of the atmosphere, the ability to hold heat, remember I talked about putting something in there that can heat up more quickly than the air, or vice versa. If you change the heat capacity of this atmosphere, everything changes. It's like the pH thing that I was talking about. You don't just go changing. Mother Earth has been around here a little while. It's been here a heck of a lot longer than we've made our mark, and I'm telling you, it's likely to be around a whole lot longer than we are. So you do not go changing that system in any significant fashion. I mention a single word here, like heat capacity. It's enough to blow the whole thing out. It's big, it's huge. Temperature has to do with availability of moisture, right? How big do you want it to get? You're talking about everything. All life, all growth, all food. You cannot go toying with any of the fundamental factors of nature. Without having huge consequence. So I don't want this to be an intellectual exercise. We can do that. You can play that game. But again, go to the principle of it. And that is enough. One thing alone. I could skip everything I'm talking about tonight. And I could present an argument that the heat quotient of the atmosphere has been altered by what's put into it. It's enough. Every one of you, with that alone, should have all the cause in the world to get this world together again. Okay? So we will be talking today about expanding that a little bit. And these others are other parts to this. You know, another one on this heat capacity, another one would be conductivity. I could throw atmospheric conductivity at you. And I don't throw it at you just for kicks. I throw it at you because of trials and trials and trials of work and, you know, Van de Graaff generators and all this stuff, okay? There's two. Biological. This was the undercurrent early on, and it was never comfortable. It started really early. My work started in the beginning of 1999. I believe probably in 1999. We can always call up the dates. But within that first year, through the process of sampling, right, no bias in that process, just starting to ask the question, hey, is there something there? The process of sampling started very early in the game to demonstrate the existence of, my polite and diplomatic phrase is, unusual biological components. Right? I'm too diplomatic, I understand, but I try to be reserved. This was my choice phrase, unusual biological components. And then I would say repeated detection of unusual biological components. And I probably still use the word, because it's still hard to know where we're going, to understand and accept where we may be going. But we'll start to sneak it in, and there's a very uncomfortable word that starts to appear, and this would be the term erythrocyte. And erythrocyte means red blood cell, And then red blood cell starts to flip everybody out, and I have to back off and say unusual biological components. And then I have to say, oh, well, it appears to be a modified form of erythrocyte. It appears that its nature is a desiccated erythrocyte. Because when you say red blood cell, what does the mind do, right? It goes all over the place. Oh my goodness, this is impossible. But when we look at the true data that comes in, that modification is extremely important. You guys know what freeze-dried means, right? How long will something stay preserved if it's freeze-dried? What kind of environment can something sustain if it's freeze-dried? When you take, drying something is one of the oldest forms of preservation there has ever been. So we'll keep that in mind as we go. But the point here is that it was very early in the game. And it was an uncomfortable process because I had to start writing this. And by what I say, right, I'll do it several times over before I'll put it out there. And I'll always say, I could be wrong, but this is what I see. And that was very uncomfortable, both for me, and in the end, it doesn't matter whether it's uncomfortable for me. But it certainly was, unpleasant. Certainly unpleasant to have to say this because I knew the imagery that takes place in the human mind. Just language is important. It evokes imagery amongst us, right? And perception. And I knew that it was. But it had to be done. Electromagnetic, I'll have to push through these probably, I'll have to push through them a little bit faster. But electromagnetic, I already gave you a clue on the ambient ELF energy. That'll be the basis of it. When you start, and also the types of materials that you put into the atmosphere, the physical nature of them, the chemical nature of them is important. It changes. And so you want to know what they are. And the work I did indicated these things have an electrical nature to them, that they are easily ionized. And so that again, here they're building up. I gave you one, I gave you two, right? Heat capacity, conductivity. Now we're talking about electromagnetic ion density of the atmosphere and how that changes things. And basically what happens is your consideration of what happens in the ionosphere. The ionosphere is this charged layer up there. It's how we listened to radio in the old days before they had a satellite. Remember the old AM radios? I still use them. They work by bouncing a signal off the ionosphere and sending it back down. That's how radio was discovered. It's a charged layer up there. Just imagine in your mind and the thinking of, instead of that charged layer being this little band confined and narrow and restricted in this certain elevation, but think in terms of what's different about it. What's different about it is that it has charged particles up there. It doesn't have to be a lot of them, but it has ions up there. Think about extending that medium, that layer down. And just what if you could take the principle that's happening up there in that layer and extend it all the way down to the ground? To some degree of effectiveness. I'm not saying at the same level, but to some degree of effectiveness. It changes everything again. And this is where the electromagnetic came in. We could have very interesting discussions about all these over time, but some of you have put up with me in the past, so you've heard some of them. Military is, oh my goodness. Military is about what in general? Military is about control of energy, ultimately, in most ways, is it not? When we develop weapons and we develop systems and we need to win a war, do we not want to control energy? It's, I think, without a doubt, one of the fundamental underlying factors of the military mind. And hopefully you're starting to see some of the connections as to where and how I was drawn into this list, because I'm starting to see things that are affecting energy and heat capacity and conductivity. I'm starting to see things. It's a logical consideration to consider the military mind and what does it need to do. Read the Bernard Eastlund patent, read it very closely, have fun on the toilet, and read every line closely and see what's in there and dissect those lines and tell me what you see. You're going to see it. Geophysical gets a little bit bigger, a little bit, like I said, more conceptual, but the idea of, is it possible that when you're, again, I look at things from a system point of view, and I'm looking now at the atmosphere being modified, a surrounding envelope, and I'm seeing long wavelengths. This ELF energy is really long wavelength. I didn't even get to talk about that, but where I'm looking at, it's longer than the Earth itself. That's why it doesn't fit, okay? Indicates artificial generation of it. But imagine putting energy into a system with an atmosphere around it. You have to start looking at the planet. And it's a hard problem, but I worked in geophysics. My work was involved in modeling the gravity field of the Earth. And so I look at problems that way, as what's the big picture? And the big picture here was that it's not impossible. Again, I don't know where to go, but it's not impossible that certain processes that affect the whole Earth might be involved. And that's what that phase of the research was about. And again, I'd love to give you more detail on it, but I don't know that I can right now. If we have time, I'll come back to it. Now, the point of this slide was exactly what the bottom says. I don't know if you can read it, but it says, after all is said and done, watch out for what you think you know. And we can go through all the work, your peer review process. You can go through that. You can be accepted. You can have everything. But pure research goes wherever you need to go, right? Wherever it is. And I have my body of what I would regard as generally conventional research in the goal of seeking a common understanding amongst people of various different levels and aspirations and backgrounds. Yes, I have that goal, and so I offer that to you. But there's quirks in the system sometime. And I'm not going to dwell on it, but I'm pointing out there are quirks. I never assume that you've got the guy under control. And this photograph this is a photograph given to me. I didn't take this directly. This was given to me by a person that I would say I regard as a reliable source. I met the person personally. I have no reason to believe that this photograph, as well as others that the individual sent me, were not genuine photographs. Now, we can debate and we can raise our speculation. My only point here, okay, what's up, guys? Right? What's up, guys? And I'm not giving the answer right now. I don't know the answer. But that's the point, is what's up, guys and gals, right? And we got to let it go tonight, but you do see something that does not fit the model. No. This is a zoom in of a person that saw a, quote, trail in the atmosphere and photographed it, and this is what appears at the head of that trail. Okay. So keep that in mind, and I have to keep that in mind myself. Don't get too cocky about what you think you know. Do your best, but keep an open mind. Okay, this brings me to the area that I need to try to get to tonight to make some forward progress in communicating certain levels of work that have taken place. Again, it's been in my head for many years. I have made numerous references to it, I'm sure, in talks or interviews that I've done. I know that in the background there is a discomfort on this issue, that there are many individuals that do not think that there is any body of evidence that would indicate a linkage that I will be proposing to you tonight. So that's my job, is to see if we can cross a little bit of a line tonight and put our foot a little bit stronger forward. 20, okay. Thank you. Okay. Narrative form, briefly. I start my work in 1999. We can read it, but I'll probably get to the chart as soon as I can. but try to pick up these main paragraphs. What it's saying is something happens in 2006. 2006, we start getting reports from the general citizens that something is going on affecting their health. It looks like bad news, and the real bad news is that nobody seems to want to talk about it again. And what they're talking about is not pleasant at all. They're talking about sores on their body, and they're talking about filaments coming out of their skin, and it sounds like it's right out of a science fiction story, and you'll see an occasional news story on it, and then, I see the patterns, and the patterns on the news story is on there. It's an isolated event, and then the baggage on the net comes out, marginalizes the people, starts calling them goofy, and I start seeing this pattern. Now, in my mind, there is a parallel set of events starting to take place with how these people are regarded, treated, and it's not fair, is what it amounts to. They're not being treated fairly. The investigations that they are due are not coming forth, and it's not making sense from a logical standpoint, because these individuals have something physical, like you see it. And they go to the doctor, and they're starting to be called crazy, that they're starting to be called delusional, even though they have something physical. It defies logic to me. So there was a problem coming out there. I do want to give credit to one that's due, and that is there is an important physical process, a testing, we call it a test, that helped to, let's say, call in to emergence this issue, and it's what's called a red wine test commonly. I just want to give credit to Dr. Gwen Scott because she is the person that that discovered that, and it's an interesting process how that occurred. Let me just say that the intuitive aspect would have been a dominant factor, but it ends up being incredibly important over the years and continues to be important. So I just want to give credit to her, and then you start to see my indications that there are certain matches and correspondences taking place between the work that's going on. And I'm going to skip the list part, which is probably harder for you to read. I'll give you another one to look at. Oh boy, I wanted to read this to you, but I'm not going to take the time, I suppose. Should I? I don't know. Okay, I'm going to read it because I don't editorialize very often in my work, but this is one that had to be done. I'll read it and we'll go on. This has to do with a Centers for Disease Control report that was issued relatively recently on the subject we're going to be going into as much as I can in the time I have left, which will be known as a Morgellons issue. Let's go quickly. A recent report by the Centers for Disease Control raises the ante of this controversy by themselves declaring a significant percentage of the material studied to be composed of proteins. The report subsequently proceeds to ignore any direct presentation of laboratory results and strategically uses terms such as likely, quote unquote, and similar, quote unquote, versus a direct presentation of chemical composition to the molecular level as is required. The report also eventually leads to a pre-directed conclusion that transforms the physical presence of these proteins into the metaphysical world and classifies the manifestation of this physical and laboratory presence as a continuing, quote, delusional condition. Suffice it to say that the objective of the scientific method is to test and resolve a hypothesis, and that it is not to generate hypotheses as a primary goal. I'll come back to that in just a second. Such thinking is to encourage the arena of speculation and obfuscation versus resolution, which is exactly what has been accomplished with the recent report. This is not science. The reader is requested to read the report from an analytical, objective, scientific, and critical thinking perspective, and not to be duped by the vagaries and critical exclusions that are apparent within the so-called report. The ludicrousness of the CDC report and the abject failure to adhere to the principles of scientific resolution will not be discussed further here. I had to get this on record, and it is on record. And again, whether it's comfortable for me, it has to be done. And without getting too much into science, just use your common sense, okay? Science underneath, it's going to be common sense. The purpose of science is not to generate a hypothesis. It's fascinating in this report. This is a report from the Centers for Disease Control casting an assessment of this issue we'll be talking about, relatively recent, within the last month or two. And after 6 to 7 years, and a little bit of money and some association with some folks like the Armed Forces of Pathology, they reach a certain conclusion that's maintained after 6 years that these folks are crazy. When you create a science question, your goal is not to generate hypotheses. Your goal is to test a hypothesis, okay? It's to test, to generate. Listen, man, we're all capable of that. We could all write a report. What is another term for generate a hypothesis? Is it not conjecture and speculation? We could all do this. You ask yourself whether this agency is deserving of your resources to produce that result. And you go find the line, because I found it. It said a primary purpose of this report is to generate hypotheses. This is insane. On we move. Thanks for putting up with it there. Okay. Now, these, I'll have to go through them quickly because I got to get to my argument with you. Many of us have seen certain photographs like this, but this will be a set of photographs to demonstrate to you what I would consider to be reasonable and realistic visual representations of this condition, whatever you wish to call it, called the Morgellons condition. It's a visual thing. It's suffering, and it's real, and it's people. And we have to have the visual recognition. So you get a few photographs, and then we have to go on. These are not atypical of what is happening. Characteristic being lesions that do not heal, at least a couple of characteristics being lesions that do not heal. Second one being a filament structure appearing from the skin. These are filaments that are appearing from the skin. This will be a little gross for folks, but sorry, go where you need to go. This is an oral sample that's coming from within the body, and this is a sink. This is a sink, and these are filament material that's coming from an oral sample. Using that red wine test that I was speaking of. I realize it's grotesque, but it's quite real. And then the last would be that these are a set of teeth, 15 was it? A set of teeth that are extracted from an individual that produces copious amounts of the filament material that you just saw recently. And the teeth have essentially been destroyed. Okay. This is the next level of representation. I'm trying to build a case. I'm giving you some idea that there's some preparatory information that's saying things are a little bit squirrely here. It doesn't look like people are doing their work right. People are being marginalized. Some things are not fitting. This is the next level, and will be a core of the argument that I would give you tonight, which I have no expectation of any of you taking this in and digesting it now. But same as I showed you the paper of the 300 papers in the 14 years, this is your visual representation of work that has been done, that you have the freedom, i.e. responsibility, to become at least aware of, if you have an interest in answering the question that I am addressing to you, and that is whether there is a linkage between geoengineering operations and biological operations. This is your material that you are to review. Now, the general pattern described in this list, and it's an interesting list. I have never seen this list until this last week. I have to give a lot of credit to the staff. We're all volunteer, by the way. But they helped me pull this list together. This is a part that's been in my mind for years, but this is the first time this information has actually been constructed in an organized fashion where you can get some kind of sense as to what it's saying. And what it's saying is, on the left side of this column are all the papers that were going on, that we're simply examining the question about, remember the phrase I said of unusual biological components? Remember when I said that? And there's this work going on, And there's no prejudice there about where that's going to lead to. It's just a series of papers that show that process of detection and analysis and presentation. And that whole left column is about work strictly on the environmental side. And this is what would be important. This is what distinguishes the left column. And that is that it is environmentally based sampling that involves detection of biological components in some fashion. That is what distinguishes the left column. It's the first time I've seen this list, like I say. Took a lot to pull these out of the whole thing. So these are all papers where, when I made references to erythrocytes being discovered or filaments being discovered and biologicals within those filaments, that is what this left column is about. On the right column, and also you'll see a date sequence. The date sequence is important. Those first guys are starting at the close of 1998, and they're going to 2010, but you see the bulk of them end about 2005, 2004 is where that work ends, right? Now on the right side, what do you see? The right side is when I made the jump or move into this topic called Morgellons. And I did that. That was done out of what I would call urgency of understanding the issue, as well as available resources. A decision had to be made. Where could I best put my time? And so in 2005, you'll see those first dates start in 2006 or so. In 2006, I start dedicating myself primarily, not entirely, but primarily to this, quote, Morgellons issue. I do want us, and I wanted to make a stronger point of it earlier, that the environmental aspect of my work, it's not something separate that's gone. That environmental work is the basis of why we are, at least I am here today. It is what brought me to this issue of studying Morgellons. So these are not separate issues in terms of the way the research was done. The right side is a list of papers that expand upon the research related specifically to the Morgellons condition. So, what is the difference between these two? On this side, environmental, biological, right? This side, human, biological, right? Now, the problem before us is to ask, is there any connection? That's the problem before us. In this very short version again tonight, I will submit to you that there is an incredibly strong case that can and has been made regarding the overlap and interaction between these two issues in a very direct fashion. That will be a contention that I would make to you. We'll run out of time to get, and that link is incredibly strong, is what it says. And this is the point of which there is to be no confusion about in my work. I may be proven wrong on every single paper, but I'm going to put it out there to the best of my ability with my resources and talents. And that conclusion that I give to you is as strong and sound as I could make it, and this conclusion is not coming off of one paper. As a matter of fact, from my position, from a logical standpoint, I could select one paper. You've got about 25 there over 10 years. I could select one paper from that list, and I could present a case to you that you are going to have to consider very fairly and reasonably. And I can't say what your final conclusion will be, but one paper will be sufficient. I am offering you and providing you with whatever this is, 24 or whatever it is, or more, that are going to make that case to you, and you are going to have to consider every one of them in their entirety and depth to make that judgment yourself. And where this is going is going to be this issue of responsibility. You know, I do believe in the human spirit, And however uncomfortable this is going to be for us, I'm telling us that we have an obligation and a responsibility to understand the true nature, extent, and scope of alteration of this planet that has and is taking place, and that it uncomfortably extends beyond the perception that we are dealing primarily with disconcerting environmental issues. Now, I'm going to have to skip all these another time, another day. This is a part of the case visually, sure. Okay, so you have the articles. This is number one. This will be the argument from a visual standpoint, which we would have to talk about in specific detail related to certain specific structures and forms that are being matched exactly. And when I say matched, the match is eventually going to be, it's going to be visual. The match is going to be metric, meaning you measure it. It has size. Size is important, not as a joke. But metric and visual, chemical behavior to the best that we have knowledge of, chemical composition to the best knowledge we have available. We don't have everything there. And fourth will be what's called spectral analysis. These four methods, and this method is not like, these matches are not like sort of close, sort of innuendos. These matches are strong, right across the board. Very strong matches. Between what? Between environmental samples and biological components and identical to similar structures that have been repeatedly found in the human body. Now, the other uncomfortable part of this, I have to get you past these. This will be visual, and this will be your spectral. The other unpleasant notion that I must mention is that the sample sizes are relatively small at this point, but of those that, let's say, express an interest and are willing to submit themselves to certain levels of examination. By the way, I'm not a doctor at all. I don't claim to be a doctor whatsoever. I'm a researcher. And within those confines, I always qualify my work. But within those that have been willing to subject themselves to certain levels of examination, there is no human being thus far that is immune from the characteristics and structures that are being observed. And time will tell what is true, but I am obviously trying to shift any perception that this, quote, Morgellons issue is somehow restricted to a rather small minority of people that we can treat as we did lepers in older times and separate them off from society and put them into their little box where we will be comfortable and, oh, please, don't touch me. I am changing that perception with you when you decide to look at the data. I'm offering that as a change that we will have to accommodate, however unpleasant that is. And obviously, that is a serious and significant statement. And the word that I will throw in conjunction with that would be degree. Life is full of degrees. Some of us get the flu with bronchitis, and some of us get a sniffle. That's what varies from what I see. Okay, I wanted to give you, and I have maybe 2 minutes at most, is what I'm seeing. I wanted to give you some of the current findings that are going on. I'll have to do this quickly. These would be very specific and current findings on my work thus far. They would be that the evidence and information indicates that the blood, again, on the sample that is there, by the way, the sample, however it's small, would be definitely statistically significant. The blood characteristics of those that have participated It's altered. There's nothing else I can say. The blood is altered from what it should be in a spectral fashion. Not trivial again, folks. You don't go fussing around with the system. This is another significant, this is like boiled down to plain and simple, best I can. This is a slide that shows direct iron extraction from certain cultures that I have made of this organization. Iron. Start to learn about how important iron is in your functioning as a human being. And the claim being made here is that the organism under examination is utilizing, absorbing, cannibalizing, however you want to say it, the iron within the human body for its own existence. Huge finding. Parasite yeah, I mean, from what I would see, we can talk about that more in the lobby, but parasitic relationship would be a rather accurate description of what I see. Number 3 here, I'll have to go quicker, but electromagnetic nature. This is a magnet. And listen, that shouldn't be a surprise, folks, when you're dealing with iron, one of the most ferromagnetic substances there is. Consequence of fussing with the iron. Your iron needs to be in a certain state of existence. Again, you can't go changing things. Your iron needs to be in a certain state of chemical existence in order to bind to oxygen. I'll make it simpler, has to be in a certain chemical state for you to breathe. And you don't go change in that chemical state because it's going to affect your ability to breathe and utilize oxygen. And respiration is the source of actually all the life processes in the end, the full meaning of respiration. Another very extremely important finding. A proteinaceous complex has been identified. Significance. Proteins are the heart of building. It is the brick. And if you can get to the proteins of things, you're getting at the core. And I'm doing the best I can. I'm going to tell you I've reached the limit. I'm going to be asking for help in some way, folks, because I've reached the limit on what I can do. I need the molecular structure of this guy. I need it badly, and I can't get it. I need some equipment. I need some tools. I know what I want, but I can't get it. But this is so important, this proteinaceous complex. And I'll give you the little hint about why it's important. We could come up with thousands of them. But one simple example of why it's important would be example of the AIDS virus. Do you know how the AIDS virus has been inhibited to a significant degree? It's by interfering with the protein construction, okay? The process of protein creation. If you can learn how to interfere with that, you can interfere with the growth process. I want it. I am stuck with the problem of trying to determine the molecular structure of something that I can't see at all. I don't have the equipment, but I know it's there. And I can present to the case why I know it's there. Protein is a huge deal. Well, I'm going to save it because I got to get through. I hope you know who can help. Okay? Yeah, I've got to go, and I thank you very much. Thanks for everything.